The heavy oak doors of the Harvard Club didn't just open, they loomed. They were monolithic slabs of polished history, each panel carved with the crests and insignia of men who had shaped empires not with swords, but with gavels, pens, and whispered deals over single malt scotch. The brass handles, worn smooth by generations of privileged palms, felt cool and faintly resistant under Lydia's touch, as if the building itself was weighing her, testing her credentials before granting entry. To most, they were an entrance, a grand, impressive one. To Judge Lydia Vance, youngest appointment to the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, they were, in that precise, crystallizing moment, a psychological barrier between the world she ruled and the one she had risen from. A border checkpoint where currency was not passports, but pedigree. She stepped inside, and the cool cathedral hush of the lobby washed over her. The air was a specific, curated blend, old leather armchairs sighing with the weight of decades, the faint, sharp tang of lemon oil on dark wood, and underneath it all, an unshakable, quiet arrogance. It was the smell of exclusivity, of decisions made in rooms without windows, of history written by the victors in their own favor. She took a slow, deliberate breath, a habit from the bench, centering herself before a complex proceeding. Her heart, usually a steady, metronomic instrument calibrated for weighing evidence and parsing constitutional nuance, betrayed a flutter of vulnerable, maternal warmth. Tonight was a celebration, not a trial. Her son, Ethan, was getting engaged. Her hand rose instinctively to adjust the collar of her modest but impeccably tailored navy suit. The wool was fine, the cut severe but flattering, a uniform of authority she wore like a second skin. Yet tonight it felt different. Beneath the tailored jacket, she wore a simple silk blouse the color of cream. In her purse, small and structured, lay two items of profound significance: her federal judge credentials in their simple leather holder, and a small velvet box containing her own mother's pearls, a single strand of luminous, perfect orbs. A gift for Madison, the soon-to-be fiancé. A gesture of welcome, of lineage offered, of a bridge between her past and Ethan's future. She allowed herself a small, private smile. Ethan, her brilliant, tender-hearted boy with his father's easy smile and her own analytical eyes. He was a public defender, idealistic and fierce, a choice that filled her with a pride so fierce it sometimes ached. He saw the best in people, fought for the forgotten. It was a quality she loved and, in this rarefied air, suddenly feared for. What happened to such men in worlds like this? Shaking off the prickle of foreboding, she took two purposeful strides across the marble floor, her low heels clicking a quiet, assured rhythm. Her destination was the grand, arched entrance to the ballroom, from which spilled the muted sounds of a string quartet and the gathering murmur of a crowd. But before the third step could land, a man in a hurried, slightly too tight black suit materialized before her as if conjured from the shadows of a potted fern. A floor manager. His face was a mask of perspiring stress, his eyes darting like trapped birds behind wire-rimmed glasses. He didn't look at her face, her suit, her bearing. His gaze fixed solely on her empty hands, the lack of a tray, a coat check ticket, any proof of utility. "Late again," he hissed, the words a low, frantic whisper. He checked a watch that glinted, thin and expensive, on his wrist. A Wharton grad's first major purchase, she guessed. With a motion of brusque efficiency, he shoved a stark white apron, crisply folded into a stiff rectangle, into her chest. The fabric was surprisingly coarse, industrial cotton against the fine silk of her blouse. "Kitchen is through the left arch, down the service corridor, look for the double steel doors. Tray service starts in 5. Don't dally, the Thorns are not to be kept waiting." The Thorns. The name landed with a thud. So, the hierarchy was already established. Lydia's hand, manicured and steady with the fine tremor of a surgeon or a judge, hovered over the soft leather of her purse. Inside, cool to the touch, was the badge, the simple, powerful shield of the United States courts. In any courtroom in the country, its presentation commanded instant, profound respect. A smile touched her lips, Part amused, part annoyed, it was a comical misunderstanding. She was about to correct him, to clarify the simple, beautiful fact that she was not late help, but the mother of the groom, a guest of honor, albeit a quiet one. She opened her mouth, the calm, resonant tone she used to silence bellicose attorneys already forming in her throat. That's when she heard it. A voice booming from the direction of the mahogany-paneled coat check cut through the lobby's subdued murmur like a cleaver. It was a voice that didn't merely speak, it held court. It was a voice she recognized instantly, not from meeting him, but from Ethan's careful, sometimes strained descriptions over the last year. Sterling Thorne. The name always preceded by a slight pause, a subtle shift in Ethan's posture. "It's about standards, Madison," he declared, loud enough for half the lobby to hear. Conversations nearby stuttered and dipped. Lydia's gaze snapped toward the sound. He was a broad silhouette against the dark wood, a man in his late 50s who had clearly won at life and made sure his body reflected it. Expensive tailoring over Jim-honed shoulders. He was holding a sable coat for a young woman, his daughter, Madison. She was slender, wrapped in a sheath of icy blue silk, her blonde hair a perfect, unmoving wave. Even from a distance, her beauty was striking, but it was a cold, manufactured thing, like a diamond in a display case. If Ethan's mother shows up looking like she just scrubbed floors, you keep her away from the partners. Park her with the aunts. Better yet, point her toward the service entrance. We can't have the cleaning lady mistaking a Supreme Court justice for a sympathetic ear and chatting him up about union dues. Understood? Optics, darling. It's all about optics. A titter of laughter escaped Madison's perfectly painted lips. She nodded, accepting the coat as her due. "Of course, Daddy. Don't worry. I'll handle it." Lydia froze. Every molecule in her body seemed to lock into place. The amused smile died, leaving her face a smooth, impassive mask. Her fingers, which had been brushing the edge of her badge through the leather, went utterly still. A cold, static shock seemed to travel from the base of her spine to the crown of her head, leaving a hyper-clarity in its wake. Every instinct honed over decades on the bench, to confront, to clarify, to command order, to uphold dignity, if not her own, then the court's, surged within her like a tidal wave. She could clear her throat, a single, sharp sound that would cut through his bluster. She could speak with the calm, resonant tone that had silenced shouting attorneys and cowed billionaire defendants. The fantasy was vivid, satisfying, but she didn't. The legal mind, the judicial temperament, overrode the human impulse. It was the part of her that knew the most valuable testimony was often the unguarded kind, offered when the witness believed themselves unobserved, superior, safe. She looked down at the apron, now clutched in her hands. The white cotton was blindingly bright against the dark wool of her suit, a visual slap. She felt its coarse texture, the weight of its implication. Slowly, she looked up, her gaze traveling through the scattered, well-dressed crowd, women in couture, men with the relaxed bearing of owned yachts, and landed on the retreating back of Sterling Thorne. He was steering Madison toward the ballroom, a hand on the small of her back, already laughing at some new private witticism. A man who had just pronounced summary judgment on a woman he'd never met, whose dignity he deemed a commodity determined solely by his perception of her tax bracket. A cold, sharp clarity descended upon her. It was a sensation as familiar as her own reflection. It was the electric focus that flooded her veins when a defendant, thinking himself clever, began weaving a tapestry of lies on the stand. It was the predatory stillness of a hunter when prey, unaware, steps into a sun-dappled clearing. It was the moment before gavel strikes wood, when the truth hangs perfectly balanced, ready to fall. Humiliation? There was none. That particular emotion required a concession of power, an acknowledgement that his assessment held weight. It did not. Anger? Oh, it was there, a hot, swift current in her blood. But she was a master of compartmentalization. She identified it, labeled it, and filed it away instantly as Exhibit A, contempt for the unseen. This wasn't a mere social faux pas, a clumsy mistake to be corrected with a laugh. This was a deposition, an unsolicited, profoundly revealing testimony on the character, values, and moral bankruptcy of the family her son sought to join. Her son, her brilliant, tender-hearted boy with his father's easy smile and her own analytical eyes. He was a public defender, idealistic and fierce, a choice that filled her with a pride so fierce it sometimes ached. He saw the best in people, fought for the forgotten. It was a quality she loved and, in this rarefied air, suddenly feared for. What happened to such men in worlds like this? Shaking off the prickle of foreboding, she took 2 purposeful strides across the marble floor, her low heels clicking a quiet, assured rhythm. Her destination was the grand, arched entrance to the ballroom, from which spilled the muted sounds of a string quartet and the gathering murmur of a crowd. But before the 3rd step could land, a man in a hurried, slightly too tight black suit materialized. Chapter 2. The Gray Rock in the Ballroom. The service corridor wasn't just a different world. It was the submerged mechanical deck of a glittering ocean liner. The ballroom above was all polished brass, sparkling crystal, and effortless grace, while here, in the stark fluorescence, the pistons fired, the boilers roared, and sweat was the primary currency. The air hung thick with the ghosts of 1,000 meals, steamed broccoli and seared beef, industrial bleach battling the persistent scent of damp mopheads, and underneath it all, the sour tang of other people's waste from the service elevators. It was a symphony of function, played in a brutalist key. The staff moved with the harried, hyper-efficient choreography of a crew keeping a vessel just ahead of a storm. Dishwashers, their faces sheened with steam and exhaustion, slammed racks into machines. Line cooks, voices hoarse, called out timings in a cryptic shorthand. Runners, mostly young, mostly people of color, darted with trays held aloft like sacred offerings, their faces set in masks of focused endurance. No one looked at Lydia's face, her good suit beneath the apron. The white cotton was a universal uniform of subservience, rendering the individual beneath it irrelevant. She was just another latecomer, another variable in a tightly calculated equation of labor. Lydia Vance, the honorable judge of the Second Circuit, receded. She didn't lock her identity away. She merely allowed it to observe from a cool, analytical distance. The part of her that issued writs and parsed constitutional nuance now focused on a more immediate task, physical and psychological camouflage. She began with her posture, the erect, commanding set of her shoulders, which filled a judicial robe with implicit authority, softened. She allowed a slight, weary slump, the ghost of an 8-hour shift on one's feet. Her chin, usually level with the horizon of a courtroom, lowered just a fraction, directing her gaze to a point on the scuffed linoleum floor about 10 feet ahead. A servant's gaze, meant to avoid eye contact, to anticipate obstacles, not engagement. She relaxed the muscles around her eyes and mouth, letting her face settle into a placid, unreadable blankness. It was an expression of pleasant vacancy, like a lightly painted wall. This was not an act of self-erasure, but a tactical application of a psychological principle she understood intimately, the gray rock method. She had encountered it in the literature on dealing with narcissists and sociopaths, but she had also seen it in practice her whole life, the way the powerless made themselves uninteresting, flat, and non-reactive to avoid the attention of predators. Become a piece of scenery. A gray rock in a stream. The water, the talk, the cruelty, the carelessness, would simply flow around you, revealing its true currents as it passed. People confessed to furniture. They revealed their ugliest selves to wallpaper. They never imagined the rock was listening, recording, judging. At a long stainless steel counter, a harried woman with a headset and a clipboard, the catering captain, her name tag read Gwen, thrust a heavy silver tray into Lydia's hands. It was laden with 30 champagne flutes, each filled to a mathematically identical point just below the rim, bubbles spiraling upwards in tiny, frantic galaxies. Perimeter service, clockwise, top-ups only, don't speak unless spoken to, and for God's sake, don't linger, Gwen barked, her eyes already scanning for the next crisis. The Thorn Party is center-left by the orchestra. The mother is in peacock blue. Do not spill on peacock blue. The dress is worth more than your annual salary. Understood? Lydia nodded, the motion small and deferential. Understood. The weight of the tray settled onto her left palm, her fingers splaying for balance. It was a familiar weight, a deep, almost ancestral muscle memory that bypassed 3 decades of professional advancement. For a dizzying second, she was 19 again, working the Saturday wedding shift at the Starlight Terrace, the tray a burning, precarious planet she had to keep from crashing. Her body remembered. It remembered the specific ache in the deltoid, the fine tremor in the fingers after the 3rd hour, the way the spine compacted under the load. She pushed through the heavy, sound-dampening swing doors, and the transformation was not just instantaneous, it was absolute. Sensory overload. The noise hit her first, not as a sound, but as a physical pressure. It was a roaring ocean of polished conversation, a cacophony of declarations and laughter that carried the timbre of unchallenged confidence. It was underscored by the melodic ding, ding, ding of crystal being touched, and woven through it all, the smooth, rich swell of a live string quartet playing something by Bach, expertly rendered, but fundamentally background, a perfume for the ears. Then the smell. It overwhelmed the kitchen ghosts clinging to her apron. Gardenias, masses of them, their cloying sweetness a weapon of olfactory luxury. This was cut through by a kaleidoscope of expensive perfumes, spicy, floral, woody, each a tiny swirling declaration of wealth. Underneath it lay the smell of starched linen, of polished wood, of fine leather, and something else, something she could only define as old money cologne, a dry, clean, slightly aloof scent of vetiver and privilege. And finally, the light. Chandeliers, not mere fixtures, but cascading constellations of cut crystal, blazed from the vaulted ceiling, casting a dazzling, diamond-bright illumination that seemed to have no shadow. It caught the fire in gemstones at throats and wrists, the gleam of silver trays, the brilliant white of teeth and laughing mouths, the liquid gold of champagne. It was a Vermeer painting come to grotesque, hyper-saturated life, a scene of elite conviviality, every detail perfect, every face a portrait of assured belonging. And Lydia Vance, in her stark white apron, became perfectly, utterly invisible within it. She moved into the edge of the crowd, a ghost. The gray rock was complete. Her posture, her gaze, her pace, all signaled one thing. I am not here for you. I am here for your glass. She was a utility, a moving part in the machinery of their enjoyment. She felt their eyes slide over her, through her, as if she were made of vapor. From behind this impeccable camouflage, her own eyes, the sharp, analytical gray of a hawk, began to scan the room. But she did not see people. She saw subjects, case studies, walking, talking bundles of admissible character evidence. Exhibit B, vacuous privilege. A woman in a shockingly emerald silk gown, her skin tanned to the color of expensive leather, held a knot of listeners captive near a potted palm. And I told the mayor, these peasants have been making wine in the same quaint way for centuries, but that doesn't mean it's good. She laughed, a sound like breaking glass. We're bringing in Australian consultants. Efficiency. If they don't like it, they can go back to milking goats. I am preserving their heritage by making it profitable. Her listeners nodded, sycophantic smiles plastered on their faces. Exhibit C, unchecked arrogance. 3 men in tuxedos so bespoke they seemed painted on, clustered near the bar, their backs to the room. The target's board is sentimental, one said with a large brandy. They talk about company legacy. We need to reframe the narrative. It's not a takeover, it's a liberation of shareholder value from the tyranny of tradition. Another chuckled. Precisely. We're not barbarians at the gate. We're the sanitation department clearing out the rot. Their language was that of colonial governors discussing a troublesome indigenous population. Exhibit D, performative philanthropy. A silver-haired man with the patrician features of a Roman coin held forth to a younger couple. So, our foundation is fully committed to solving urban literacy. We've pivoted to a pure venture philanthropy model. If the metrics from the Southside pilot don't show a 15% improvement in third-grade reading levels within 18 months, we pull the funding. No room for sentiment. It's a business like any other. He said this with the serene smile of a man bestowing grace. Lydia moved among them, her tray a silent offering. Glasses were lifted from it without a glance, without a word. A hand would appear, take a flute, and retreat back into the conversation, as if the tray were a branch bearing fruit that magically replenished itself. She was not served, she was the conduit for service. The experience was strangely clarifying. This was the ecosystem, the petri dish in which the Thorne family was the most virulent strain. She felt a cold, clarifying detachment. This wasn't about her anymore. It was an anthropological study, a dissection. Then her clinical scan found him, Ethan. Her son stood near a towering, precarious sculpture of interlocking champagne flutes, a feat both of catering engineering and profound waste. He looked heartbreakingly handsome in his classic black tuxedo, but the elegance was undermined by his posture. He was coiled tight, a spring compressed. One hand was shoved in his pocket, the other held an untouched flute of champagne like a prop he'd forgotten how to use. His eyes, those intelligent, gentle gray eyes he'd inherited from her, were scanning the crowd with a desperate, searching anxiety. He was looking for her. His gaze swept past her once, twice, the apron, the lowered head, the tray, creating a perfect blind spot. On the third pass, something, perhaps the familiar set of her shoulders beneath the disguise, the particular stillness of her watchfulness, snagged his attention. His eyes locked onto hers across the crowded, glittering expanse. He saw the journey his expression took in the space of 2 heartbeats. First, shock, a physical jolt. Chapter 3. The Discovery Phase. The Thorne family's gravitational field was a tangible thing. Lydia felt it as a pressure change, a subtle warp in the room's social fabric, pulling conversations, sycophants, and flutes of champagne toward its epicenter. She let it draw her in, a silent asteroid caught in orbit, her tray of crab cakes a convenient shield. She found them exactly where their sense of theater demanded, stage left of the string quartet, positioned so the soaring music seemed a personal soundtrack to their importance. They occupied a cleared space of Persian rug, a velvet-roped VIP area in a room that was already a private club. It was less a gathering and more a receiving line in the round. Sterling Thorne was, without question, the sun. Not a warm, life-giving star, but a dense, greedy neutron star, pulling all light and attention into himself. He stood with his legs slightly apart, a conqueror's stance, a heavy, cut-crystal tumbler of amber scotch, Glenfiddich 30, Lydia noted automatically, held loosely in his hand. He didn't merely gesture, he conducted the air around him, his free hand carving out empires, dismissing objections, summoning laughter. His voice was a polished bass baritone, calibrated to carry without seeming to shout, the voice of a man used to being listened to. He was comfortable here, expansive. This wasn't just his habitat, it was his kingdom, and every laughing partner, every deferential waiter, every piece of inherited silver was a subject. He was the undisputed king of this velvet jungle. And he had not the faintest inkling that the jungle had eyes, that the vines held recording devices, and the quiet birds were witnesses. Lydia's gaze from behind the perfect blind of her tray shifted to the princess of this domain, Madison. The girl was a study in calculated perfection. The ivory silk gown was indeed a masterpiece, likely a sleeveless, columnar creation from a stealth wealth designer, its only ornamentation a cascade of hand-sewn seed pearls from shoulder to hem that caught the light like captured tears. It was a dress that announced its cost in a whisper only the initiated could hear. But Madison wore it like a suit of armor. Her posture was ramrod straight, her shoulders pinned back, not with confidence, but with the acute awareness of being on display. Her smile, dazzlingly white, was an instrument she deployed with precision, a flash for her father's jokes, a softer, more public version for Ethan, a tight, closed-lipped acknowledgement for lesser guests. It never reached her eyes, which were the pale, acquisitive blue of a winter sky, constantly scanning, assessing, comparing. A test presented itself almost immediately. A young busboy, no more than 19, his face shiny with sweat and his tuxedo shirt straining at the buttons, navigated the crowd with a wobbling tower of dirty glassware. The physics of his task were precarious. As he tried to edge past the thorn circle, his elbow brushed against the silk-draped arm of one of Madison's bridesmaids. Madison didn't startle. She didn't look at the boy. Without breaking her conversation, a vapid analysis of the floral arrangements, she simply extended her empty champagne flute sideways between herself and the bridesmaid and snapped her fingers, twice, sharp, percussive cracks that cut through the murmur. The boy flinched as if struck. His eyes went wide with panic. He juggled his teetering tower, managed to hook his thumb through the flute's stem, and extracted it with a clumsy yank that nearly sent the whole edifice of glassware crashing down. He scurried away, face burning with humiliation. Not a word of thanks, not a glance of acknowledgement. He had been a momentary obstacle, an autoimmune response to an irritant now dispatched. Exhibit I, reflexive dehumanization, filed. Lydia absorbed this, the data point slotting into a grimly coherent picture. Then Sterling's voice boomed out, seizing the conversational reins once more. "And that's the beauty of the structural leverage," he was saying to a circle of men who wore their wealth in the quiet thickness of their watchbands and the custom fit of their jackets. "But enough shop talk. Tonight's a celebration." He spread his arms, a benevolent monarch. "My Maddie's big night." He pulled his daughter to his side with a rough, possessive affection. She preened under the attention. "We're all so happy for you, Madison," a woman cooed, her face a mask of Botoxed sincerity. "Thank you, Cynthia," Madison replied, her voice a cool, practiced melody. "We're just so blessed." The word sounded foreign on her lips. "And the young man," Cynthia pressed, looking around. "Where is the lucky fellow?" "Ethan's around here somewhere," Sterling said, his tone shifting to one of jovial condescension. He took a slow sip of scotch, letting the moment build. "A good kid, a solid kid. Has that public service zeal, you know? Wants to save the world one pro bono case at a time." He chuckled, inviting the others to share in the gentle ribbing of noble naivety. "Bright, sure, got into Yale Law on his own steam, which is something." He paused, his eyes twinkling with the delight of a man about to deliver a punchline he finds enormously clever. "But let's be honest among friends," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratory murmur that was, thanks to his natural projection, perfectly audible to Lydia 3 feet away. "He's marrying up, way, way up. We're doing a bit of a charity case here, but what can you do? Maddie's set her heart on it. Thinks she can refine the raw material." He laughed, a single sharp ha that was more expulsion of air than sound of joy. "We'll write the wedding off as a philanthropic deduction. Call it urban outreach." The circle erupted in guffaws. The fleshy-faced partner, Henry, wheezed with mirth, slapping his thigh. Cynthia tittered behind a bejeweled hand. Celeste Thorne offered her ghost of a smile, her eyes vacant. Madison simply looked pleased, as if her father had complimented her choice of a uniquely interesting accessory. A flash of white-hot, primordial fury ignited in the very center of Lydia's chest. It was a chemical fire, fed by decades of sacrifice, of nights spent studying so her bones ached, of swallowing pride so her son could have portions, of a love so ferocious that it had built a life from rubble. The image that erupted in her mind was visceral, her tray of delicate crab cakes upended, the china shattering against Sterling Thorne's Brioni lapel, the greasy residue of charity staining the fine wool, her hands around his throat, her judicial voice roaring the truth into his smug, laughing face. Her knuckles whitened on the edge of the tray, her breath hitched. But she was Judge Lydia Vance, the woman who had stared down mob lawyers, who had remained icily calm as weeping families described their losses, who had held the line against political pressure that could have bent steel. The white-hot fury met the glacier of her discipline. She did not move, she did not react. With a mental precision that was her greatest weapon, she identified the emotion, isolated it, analyzed its source, and filed it. It was no longer anger, it was evidence, contempt for the groom's lineage, with intent to demean. She noted the audience, the performative nature of the cruelty, the specific financial metaphor, philanthropic deduction, that reduced her son's worth to a line item. This was no longer a personal insult. It was a deposition, a sworn statement of character offered freely by the opposing party. This was the discovery phase, and the beauty of it, the profound, chilling advantage she held, was that unlike in her courtroom, where the defense was on notice and guarded every syllable, here the opposing counsel was not only unaware the trial had commenced, he was acting as his own hostile witness, volunteering testimony with a reckless, grinning abandon. The fury, now transformed into cold, crystalline focus, told her what she needed to do next. Get closer, eavesdrop not on the performance, but on the quiet talks between acts. She needed the unguarded moment, the aside, the truth that slipped out when they thought the only listeners were mirrors and furniture. She drifted closer, a phantom with a purpose. Her movements were those of the serving staff, a slow, unobtrusive glide, eyes on the tray, body angled to slip through spaces without touching. She exchanged her empty crab cake tray for a bottle of Macallan 18 and a fresh tumbler from a passing beverage cart. The bottle was heavy, its glass cool and substantial. She waited for a break in Sterling's monologue, a moment when he turned to accept a compliment from a new arrival. Then she moved into the space beside him, a servant materializing to fulfill a need he hadn't yet voiced. "More scotch, sir?" she asked. She didn't just lower her voice, she gutted it. She stripped it of all resonance, all the lower registers that conveyed authority and education. What remained was a flat, slightly nasal mid-range tone, the voice of a woman who expected to be a conduit, not a person. It was the voice of someone who answered, never asked. Sterling Thorne didn't turn his head. He didn't glance. Chapter 4. The Source Code. The double doors of the ballroom swung shut behind her with a soft, definitive whoomph, severing her connection to the roaring, perfumed world like a surgeon's clamp. The silence that rushed into the vacuum was not peaceful. It was stark, industrial, a white noise of distant, percussive clatter and the low electrical hum of machines doing their thankless work. The air in the service corridor was a different element altogether. Heavy with the chemical bite of industrial-strength detergent, the damp sock odor of boiled linen, the ghost of 1,000 burnt coffee rinds lurking in the drains. It smelled of labor, of the hidden metabolism that kept the gleaming body alive. To the constellation of lawyers, heiresses, and captains of industry in the ballroom, this hallway was a non-place, a utility, a secret they would never need to know, like the location of their own spleen. They passed its doors without seeing them, their reality ending at the polished brass handles. But as Lydia Vance leaned back against the cool, unforgiving tile of the wall, taking a deep, deliberate breath that filled her lungs with this honest stench, she didn't feel like she was hiding. She didn't feel diminished. She felt, for the first time all evening, grounded, authentic. The coarse cotton of the apron oppressed between the fine wool of her suit and the hard wall was a grounding wire, connecting her to a fundamental truth. She looked down at her hands, still holding the empty silver tray. In the fluorescent glare, they were revealed. Hands of a judge. Manicured nails filed to neat ovals, clear polish. Skin softened by years of expensive lotions, protected from the elements by climate-controlled chambers and chauffeur-driven cars. Hands that wielded gavels, that annotated legal briefs with a Mont Blanc pen, that rested on polished mahogany while pondering the fate of millions. She flexed her fingers slowly, and there it was. Not a pain, but a memory of pain, a phantom ache deep in the knuckles and the meat of the palm. A muscle memory, 30 years dormant but indelible. 30 years. The corridor dissolved. The fluorescent lights became the sickly, greenish glow of the nighttime custodial lamps in the Bronx Supreme Court. The smell of bleach became overpoweringly real. She was 22 again, drowning in a gray jumpsuit that crackled with industrial starch, the fabric rough against her skin, smelling of other people's sweat and floor wax. The weight in her hands wasn't a silver tray. It was the cold, unwieldy steel handle of a mop bucket, sloshing with gray water and the ghosts of the day's crimes and civil disputes. She could feel the specific, bone-deep fatigue in her legs after 8 hours of pushing that bucket across acres of cold marble, the same marble she would one day walk across in a black robe, her footsteps echoing with authority instead of shuffling with servitude. She remembered the soundtrack, the squeak of her rubber-soled shoes, the splash and slosh of the mop, the distant echoing cough of a night guard, the rumble of the floor buffer from another wing. And she remembered the book, a battered, used copy of Griswold and Barron's constitutional law, its spine cracked, its pages stained with highlighter and desperation. The specific, slightly warped thwack it made when she propped it open on the bright yellow, wet floor sign she carried with her, like a sad, mobile lectern. Between emptying trash bins overflowing with discarded legal motions, she'd read the fragments, trying to decipher the logic, and scrubbing the toilets of men who would later argue before her with patronizing grandeur, she would steal time. 5 minutes here, 10 minutes there. Her back against a cold marble pillar, her legs screaming for relief, she would drill the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause into her brain by the dim, soul-sucking light, the words swimming before her exhausted eyes. She didn't learn the law in the hallowed halls of Yale. She learned it by cleaning up after the people who practiced it. She learned their carelessness from the half-eaten sandwiches and coffee cups they left on benches meant for weeping families. She learned their arrogance from the way they strode through her puddles without a glance, their expensive shoes clicking on the wet stone. She learned their moral flexibility from the whispered fragments of hallway deals she overheard while pretending to be invisible, a gray ghost with a mop. The client will never know. Just need the judge to look the other way. It's not illegal if you don't get caught. Those fragments were her first lessons in jurisprudence. They taught her that the law was not some pristine temple, but a battlefield, and the weapons were often hidden in plain sight, in the arrogance of those who thought themselves its masters. Sterling Thorne, in his Brioni tuxedo, looked at a server, at her in this apron, and saw a failure of ambition, a static, servile element in the backdrop of his personal triumph, a biological robot, programmed to fetch and carry, whose dreams, if he conceded she had any, were small, pitiable things, a better apartment, a used car, a vacation to a beach she'd seen on TV. Lydia Vance looked at a server and saw something else entirely. She saw the latent, burning power that built empires from nothing, the relentless, unsentimental hunger that could fuel a climb from the sub-basement to the penthouse. That hunger was not a flaw. It was a primal engine. It was her source code. It was the fire in the boiler room that powered the whole ship, while the passengers on the upper decks sipped champagne and admired the view. That was why she hadn't torn off the apron in the lobby. That was why she hadn't screamed, hadn't flashed her badge, hadn't corrected the world with a sentence. Stripping off the uniform would have been a denial of that source code. It would have been agreeing with his assessment that it was something shameful to be shed. Wearing it, embracing its coarse reality, didn't lower her status. It reconnected her to it. It was a touchstone, a reminder of the raw, gritty ore from which she had been smelted. The apron wasn't a disguise. It was a homecoming. She closed her eyes, leaning her head back against the tile. Behind her eyelids, not in nostalgia, but in a cold, forensic audit, she ran the numbers. It was a lifelong habit, a mental ledger she'd never broken, the balance sheet of a life built from scratch. Ethan, her beautiful, idealistic son, didn't know the full extent of the ledger. He knew the outlines, the child's version of the story. Mom worked hard, Mom went to school, Mom became a judge. He didn't know the brutal arithmetic. He didn't know that his father, a man of charming words and shallow foundations, walked out one Tuesday afternoon leaving behind nothing but a half-empty closet and a crater of debt. She was a first-year teacher. He didn't know she sat at the kitchen table, the formica sticky with Ethan's apple juice, and stared at two piles of paper. One was the notice of eviction from their affordable apartment in a fading but decent neighborhood zoned for a good school. The other was the statement for her meager teacher retirement fund, $14,318.18, a nest egg for a future that had just vanished. She liquidated every penny of it, paid off the predatory landlord's penalty, secured a tiny roach-infested studio in the good school district, and survived for 18 months on a diet of rice, beans, and a fury so bright, so incandescent, it burned away need for sleep. That fury fueled her as she graded papers by candlelight during blackouts, studied for the LSAT on the subway during her commute, and learned to sew so she could mend her clothes until the fabric disintegrated. The fury was her second heart. She didn't know his semester abroad in London, the experience that opened his eyes to the world, that cemented his desire to practice international human rights law, had a price tag far beyond tuition. It cost her 3 years of vacations she never took. It cost 1,000 small denials, shoes resoled until the cobbler shook his head, a winter coat lined with newspaper for insulation, headaches when friends invited her out for dinner, the silent, shame-faced return of a much-needed prescription because the copay was too high that week. She had bought him that horizon with the currency of her own deferred life. She had been the silent, majority investor in Ethan Vance. She had poured every ounce of her sweat equity into his character, his empathy, his unshakable sense of justice. She built him, stone by precious stone, into a man who valued people over portfolios. The Thorns were late-stage speculative investors, venture capitalists of the social sphere. They'd shown up when the stock, Ethan, was already high and soaring, a blue-chip prospect with a heart of gold and a bright future. They saw a valuable, attractive asset they wanted to add to their portfolio. They were trying to execute a hostile takeover to acquire a controlling interest in a company they had no hand in building, whose foundational value, forged in sacrifice and fury, they could never comprehend and would likely dismantle for scrap. She thought of the checks Sterling had, according to Ethan's uncomfortable confession, bragged about writing for this very venue. $50,000, a line item for him, a line item. He thought that the ballroom had entered its second, more volatile state. The carefully calibrated social chemistry of the evening had been altered by the catalyst of free-flowing alcohol. Inhibitions, those thin varnishes of civility, were softening, while the underlying pretensions, the need to impress, to dominate, to claim space, were sharpening, exposed like bones after a fire. The laughter was louder, more brittle. Conversations had shed their hushed conspiratorial tones and swelled into declarations. The air, once thick with perfume, now carried the sour-sweet tang of champagne breath and the acrid bite of expensive cigar smoke drifting in from the terrace. Lydia moved through this altered atmosphere with heightened senses. She had exchanged her champagne bottle for a heavy silver tray of crab cakes, perfect golden brown orbs nestled on beds of microgreens and dotted with saffron aioli. She was no longer a passive observer mapping the terrain. She was an active agent, collecting forensic samples. Each interaction was a receipt, a documented transaction in the economy of arrogance. Her orbit, precise as a planetary body, drew her toward the bank of floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking black glass view of the city's glittering spine. Here, in the cinematic glow of the skyline, the Thorne family was staging a photo shoot. It was a tableau of curated elegance, less a spontaneous moment than a corporate branding exercise. Madison Thorne was the radiant, unwavering center. She was posed on a velvet settee, the ivory silk of her gown arranged in artful folds by a hovering, anxious wedding planner. She wasn't smiling for the camera so much as issuing a smile, a brilliant, frozen product. Flanking her were her bridesmaids, a curated spectrum of blonde, brunette, and redhead, each in a complementary but deliberately less spectacular shade of dusky rose. They were less like friends and more like aesthetically pleasing accessories, human bouquets chosen for their ability to reflect Madison's light without generating any of their own. Their smiles were tight, their eyes occasionally darting with a trapped animal awareness. Lydia paused at the periphery, her tray a shield. She watched as the photographer, a man with a painfully earnest manner, tried to coax a natural laugh. "Think of something funny, Madison. Your first kiss with Ethan." Madison's laugh was a short, sharp ha that sounded like a board cracking. Her eyes remained flat, scanning the room beyond the photographer's shoulder, cataloging who was watching. It was then that Sophia entered the frame. The young server was navigating the crowded room with a tray identical to Lydia's, her path a careful slalom between tuxedos and gowns. Her face was a mask of concentration, her knuckles white where she gripped the tray's edge. Lydia could see the faint tremor in her hands, a combination of physical strain and the low-grade terror of moving through a minefield of fragile egos and even more fragile, expensive fabrics. Sophia approached the Thorne photo circle. She didn't interrupt, she didn't hover. She took up a position just outside the pool of bright light, a respectful, deferential distance, and waited. She stood perfectly still, her eyes downcast, waiting for a natural break. It was an act of professional patience that spoke of a hard-learned understanding of her place. The photographer paused to change a lens. A momentary silence fell. Sophia seized it. She took a half step forward, her voice a soft, clear instrument designed to inform, not intrude. "Hors d'oeuvre, Miss Thorne? Crab cake with saffron aioli." Madison, mid-adjustment of a pearl earring, spun around on the velvet cushion. The movement was swift, violent. The transformation of her face was a masterclass in unveiled contempt. The polished photo-ready mask dissolved, replaced by a flash of irritation so pure, so venomous, it was like a chemical peel revealing raw flesh beneath. Her lip curled, her nostrils flared. "God, no!" she snapped, the words a whip crack in the hushed space. She recoiled physically, jerking back as if Sophia had thrust a plate of live cockroaches or radioactive waste toward her. "Are you blind or just stupid? I specifically told the coordinator, I emailed the menu coordinator twice. No shellfish near the bridal party. My skin is insanely sensitive. I break out in hives that last for weeks. Are you trying to kill me, or are you just spectacularly incompetent?" Her voice had risen, losing its melodic coolness and acquiring a shrill nasal edge that carried over the quartet's rendition of Pachelbel's canon. The conversation in the immediate vicinity stuttered and died. The bridesmaids froze, their painted smiles turning to wax. The wedding planner looked as if she might faint. The music, in Lydia's hyper-focused perception, didn't just fade, it ceased to exist. Her entire world telescoped down to this 10-foot radius of cold marble, hot shame, and icy fury. Sophia paled, the color draining from her face so completely she looked like a charcoal sketch on parchment. The tray in her hands dipped dangerously. "I'm sorry," she stammered, her voice a thin thread. The captain didn't." "Clearly, you don't know much," Madison cut her off, not even letting her finish the apology. Her words were bullets of practiced disdain, each one aimed to maim. "You people never do. Go away, now, before you ruin the dress. You're practically breathing on it." She made a shooing motion with her hand, flicking her fingers as if dispersing a bad smell. Tears, hot and humiliating, welled in Sophia's eyes. They didn't fall, they shimmered, magnifying the deep, intelligent brown into pools of utter devastation. A small, choked sound escaped her. She turned to flee, her vision blurred, her only thought escape from the searing spotlight of cruelty. In her blind, humiliated haste, she misjudged the space. Her hip bumped the sharp, polished edge of a nearby high-top table. The impact was slight, but it was enough. On the table's edge sat a single forgotten champagne flute, half full, abandoned by a guest. It wobbled, a delicate crystalline dance of impending doom. It tipped. Time seemed to slow for Lydia. The flute pirouetted off the edge, falling in a graceful, terrible arc. It struck the marble floor with a sound that tore the very air, a high, crystalline crash that silenced the entire quadrant of the ballroom. The glass exploded into 1,000 glittering shards. Champagne, now just flat, sticky liquid, splashed in a star-shaped pattern on the dark stone, a good 3 feet from the hem of Madison's precious gown. The effect, however, was apocalyptic. A collective gasp swept through the crowd. This was drama. This was a breach of the perfect narrative. "Unbelievable!" The roar came from Sterling Thorne, who had been holding court nearby. He bulled his way forward, his face mottling with a spectacular purplish rage. He didn't look at the sparkling, dangerous debris. He didn't glance at Sophia, who stood frozen, a statue of horror, a single tear finally tracing a path through her powder. He didn't check if slivers of glass had cut her stockings or her shaking hands. He pointed a thick, damning finger at the shimmering mess on the floor, his jowls trembling, and then he did something worse than shout. He laughed. It was a cruel, barking sound, devoid of humor, engineered solely for humiliation. It was the laugh of a man who finds the failure of others to be the highest form of entertainment. "You see this, Ethan?" he boomed, turning to where Lydia's son stood rooted to the spot near the window. Sterling's voice was a public announcement of disdain. This is precisely why we pay for the VIP package, to avoid the riffraff, the incompetence. I tell you, good help isn't just hard to find these days, it's extinct, a lost species. We're witnessing the last gasp of basic competence." Ethan looked physically ill. The blood had drained from his face, leaving him ashen. His eyes, wide with shock, darted from Sterling's gloating face to Sophia's shattered one, to the cruel, satisfied smirk now playing on Madison's lips. For months, perhaps years, he had made excuses, swallowed slights, bent his own moral compass to fit into this world for the sake of love. But this vicious public evisceration of a young woman for a simple mistake was a bridge too far. It was a direct assault on everything he believed in. His body tensed. He took a step forward, his mouth opening, his own dignity and sense of justice finally overriding a lifetime of people-pleasing instinct. But Madison was faster. Her hand shot out, not in comfort, but in claim. She placed her palm flat on the black wool of her tuxedo jacket, right over his heart. It was a gesture of pure physical possession. Her fingers pressed, not a caress, but a silencing push.
She pulled him back toward her, back into the fold of the thorns, her eyes on his face with a warning as clear as a shout. You are one of us. Do not side with the help. Ethan hesitated, the words dying in his throat, the fight drained out of his shoulders, replaced by a confusion so profound it was agony to witness. He was trapped between the woman he loved and the fundamental truth of his own character.
The air in the service corridor was a balm. It smelled of reality, harsh soap, damp concrete, and the honest sweat of labor. Sophia, the young server, was leaning against a stack of linen crates, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent, shuddering sobs. The sounds were the worse for being muted. They spoke of a pain practiced in private. Lydia stood beside her, not touching her, but a solid, silent presence. She said nothing. Platitudes were useless. Action was the only currency that mattered here. After a moment, she reached into the deep pocket of her apron and pulled out a clean, folded linen napkin, starched to a crisp rectangle. She held it out. Sophia flinched, then peeked through her fingers. Seeing the offering, not a hand, she slowly lowered her hands. Her makeup was a ruined watercolor of mascara and foundation. She took the napkin with trembling fingers. Thank you, she hiccuped, dabbing at her eyes. Don't thank me, Lydia said, her voice low and even. Save your energy. They've taken enough of it tonight. I'm so sorry, Sophia whispered, the apology automatic. I ruined everything. The glass, the noise. You broke a $5 flute, Lydia corrected, her tone leaving no room for argument. They created the spectacle. You were the catalyst for their true nature. Remember that. Their ugliness is not your responsibility. Sophia looked at her, truly looked, the confusion cutting through her distress. The woman in the apron spoke with an authority that felt judicial, parental, ancient. Who are you? Right now, Lydia said, a ghost of a smile touching her lips, I'm the person who is going to make sure you walk out of here tonight with your job, your dignity, and the knowledge that they are not the gods they pretend to be. She paused, her hawk's eyes taking in the girl's intelligent face, the textbook peeking from a worn tote bag stashed under the crates. You study, don't you? A flicker of pride, quickly subdued by shame, crossed Sophia's face. She nodded. LSATs. I wanted to go to law school. The past tense was a tiny, heartbreaking dagger. Wanted, Lydia pressed gently. Sophia's eyes filled again, but this time with a different, more profound sorrow. It doesn't matter. Some things aren't for people like me. Lydia's mind filed the statement away. Exhibit M, stolen ambition. Another crime, not yet fully understood. She placed a hand, firm and steady, on Sophia's shoulder. Everything is for people like you, especially the law. It was built by people like them, she nodded toward the ballroom doors, to protect people like them. It needs people like you to reclaim it. Now, take 5 minutes, splash water on your face, then go back out there and hold your head so high they get a crick in their necks looking up at you. Can you do that? The girl drew a shaky breath, then a deeper, steadier one. She nodded, a spark of defiance rekindling in her damp eyes. Yes. Good. Lydia gave her shoulder a final slight squeeze and turned away. The interlude was over. The tender moment was a tactical retreat, a regrouping of forces. Now it was time to advance on the main enemy stronghold. In the bustling staging area, she didn't retrieve another tray of canapes. She went straight to the temperature-controlled wine cradle, where bottles of vintage Dom Perignon rested like sleeping royalty in beds of crushed ice. She selected a 2008 bottle, its glass fogged with cold condensation. The weight in her hand was substantial, promising. This wasn't fuel for idle celebration. This was the lubricant for hubris, the truth serum of the overconfident. She pushed back into the ballroom, the bottle held like a scepter of her new purpose. She didn't circle the perimeter this time. She moved with direct, silent intent toward the far corner, opposite the windows and the orchestra.
This was the room's true inner sanctum, a place where the decorative columns created a recessed alcove, semi-private and inherently powerful. Here, the air was different, thinner, colder. The celebratory noise from the party's heart was muted, a distant roar against which this enclave defined itself. It was where the alpha predators retreated to feed, away from the herd. The senior partners of Thorne and Partners stood in a tight, impenetrable phalanx of black wool and white silk. Their backs were turned to the room, a unified wall of privilege and exclusion. Their body language was not that of wedding guests. It was of a war council. Shoulders were hunched, heads were bent close. The clink of their glasses was not festive, but tactical. They weren't discussing a union. They were discussing a kill. Lydia slowed her approach, becoming a shadow, a piece of mobile scenery. She paused just outside the circle's gravitational pull, close enough to hear, invisible enough to be ignored. She began to top up the glass of a man on the fringe, a younger partner with a nervous tick in his jaw. At the circle's heart, Sterling Thorne was holding court, his voice lowered to a conspiratory purr. Yet, through some acoustic trick of towering arrogance, it carried with perfect, damning clarity to her trained ears. "The Meridian antitrust merger is a done deal, gentlemen," Sterling declared, swirling the last of his scotch. The ice cubes clinked like tiny bones. $40 billion, the single biggest payout this firm has seen in a decade. It will redefine the landscape. It will make our children rich. A low murmur of avaricious approval rippled through the men. Lydia moved to the next glass, belonging to an older partner she vaguely recognized from the pages of The American Lawyer, Charles something. His face was etched with deep lines of what might have been wisdom, but looked more like chronic anxiety. He was the designated worrier, the canary in the coal mine of their conscience. He was staring into his champagne as if it contained bad news. "I don't know, Sterling," he murmured, barely audible. He was the designated worrier, the canary in the coal mine of their conscience. He was staring into his champagne as if it contained bad news. "I don't know, Sterling," he murmured, barely audible. "I do know that Stephanie Haw is chair. She's tough as nails. One strike and you're out." Sterling laughed. It was a dry, dismissive sound, like dead leaves crunching under a heavy boot. "Haw, please." He said her name as if tasting something faintly ridiculous. "Let's not elevate her. She's a diversity hire with a bleeding heart, a 2-for-1 special. Spent her formative years in family court, for God's sake, listening to babies cry and divorced couples squabble over who gets the dog. She cares about feelings, about social equity. She doesn't understand fiscal quarters, market leverage, or the fact that $40 billion in economic activity trumps a few hurt feelings any day of the week. She's a minnow, gentlemen, and we are the sharks. She's so far out of her depth, she's in another ocean." Lydia allowed herself a slow, internal blink. Exhibit N. Willful underestimation of opposing counsel with prejudice. She filed it next to the earlier contempt. The portrait of his arrogance was becoming a masterpiece. Charles was not appeased. Be that as it may, her reputation is for being meticulous, a stickler for procedure. She finds cracks, and the environmental impact reports, the real ones from our own due diligence, if she sees the toxicity levels in the water table data downstream from the Meridian plant, she'll block the merger on Clean Water Act violations without a second thought. It's not a crack, it's a canyon. It's a slam dunk for her. Sterling took a long, slow sip of the fresh scotch a different server had provided. He let the silence stretch, a king in dispensing not just wisdom, but absolution. "She won't see them." The circle went preternaturally quiet. The distant sounds of the string quartet seemed to warp, becoming a dissonant soundtrack. Even the anxious Charles looked shocked. A man with a face like a startled ferret leaned in. We're not going to shred them, are we?" he whispered, aghast. "That's a one-way ticket to disbarment, or worse." Sterling fixed him with a withering look of contempt. Don't be melodramatic, Paul. We're not amateurs. We're not criminals. He paused, letting the distinction hang, pregnant with hypocrisy. We're strategists. We're going to bury them. He leaned into the center of the circle, his voice dropping to a silken, sinister thread that Lydia had to strain to catch, though every syllable burned itself into her memory. We took the damning toxicity reports, the ones that show lead, arsenic, and enough perfluorinated chemicals to glow in the dark, and we didn't destroy them. That would be stupid. We buried them. In the physical discovery handover to the JDI, there is a box 4000. It contains, by our meticulous accounting, approximately 2 million pages of documents. In the middle of that box, between 10,000 pages of utterly irrelevant cafeteria purchasing receipts from 2005 and 15,000 pages of employee parking validation logs, we placed the reports, 117 pages of geological and hydrological data that would sink the merger. The needle in the haystack isn't just hidden, it's surrounded by an ocean of legitimate, mind-numbing chaff. He leaned back, a smug smile on his face. She's a federal judge with a...
Flushed with perceived victory, Sterling Thorne was drunk on a more potent intoxicant than alcohol, the giddy, reckless euphoria of impunity. He had just outlined a plan to defraud a federal court to a circle of his most trusted allies, and their response had been glasses raised in a toast. His power wasn't just acknowledged, it was celebrated. The merger was his. The judge was a negligible obstacle. The world was his compliant oyster. This sense of invincibility loosened his tongue, shifted his focus from the macro corruption to the micro. He draped a heavy, comradely arm around the shoulders of Charles, the anxious senior partner. The gesture was less about friendship and more about possession. Charles was another asset in his portfolio, one that needed occasional reassurance. His voice, still carrying that obscene conspiratorial purr, now swelled with paternal pride. And it's not just the firm winning today, Sterling beamed, his gaze sweeping across the ballroom to land on Madison, who was now holding court by the champagne tower, a queen holding levee. We're hitting on all cylinders tonight, familial triumphs, too. My Maddie, he said the name with a proprietary warmth, just secured the summer associate position at the Solicitor General's office, the D.C. internship. Charles, ever the careful one, managed to extract himself slightly from Sterling's grip. He raised an appreciative, if wary, eyebrow. Impressive. That program accepts, what, 3, maybe 4 applicants a year? It's reserved for the absolute top percentile of the Ivy League, usually Harvard, Yale, Stanford. Lydia, in the process of refilling a glass for a partner on the circle's edge, froze. The bottle of Dom Perignon halted, its effervescent stream suspended mid-air. The Solicitor General's summer internship. She knew it intimately, viscerally. She didn't just know of it, she sat on its bipartisan Congressional Oversight Committee. She had helped draft the stringent firewall protocols to ensure its selection process was a fortress against exactly this kind of backdoor dealing. It was famously, brutally meritocratic. Applications were anonymized, stripped of names, schools, and photos. They were graded by a rotating panel of career civil servants and academics on a rigid rubric: writing sample, academic record, LSAT score, and a blind review of a legal analysis exercise. Pedigree and connections were explicitly excluded from the matrix. It was one of the last pure pipelines of true meritocracy in a system buckling under the weight of legacy and wealth. Sterling chuckled, a low, oily sound that seemed to slither through the air. He let the euphemisms hang, a knowing smirk playing on his lips. It was the language of corruption polished to a high sheen. Charles's face remained carefully neutral, a mask of professional detachment, but his eyes betraying a flicker of profound distaste. "Adjustments?" he asked, the word a blade of ice. Sterling smiled in waver. but it hardened at the edges. He waved a dismissive hand, as if batting away a trivial nuisance. There was a minor complication. A candidate, a girl from some state school in the flyover country, University of Michigan or Illinois or some such, a public university grind, had a perfect LSAT score, apparently, a real striver. He imbued the word with contempt, making it sound like a pathology. All book smarts, no street smarts, no pedigree, no connections, no understanding of how the real world works. We couldn't let a slot of that prestige, that potential, go to waste on someone who wouldn't know how to leverage it, someone who'd probably end up in legal aid or chasing slip-and-fall cases in some county courthouse. A terrible return on investment for the program, really. He sighed, a parody of regret. So, during the final review cycle, her application suffered an unfortunate logistical error, got misplaced. A genuine shame. These things happen. The blood in Lydia's veins didn't just run cold, it crystallized. A sharp, painful freeze flashed through her, followed by a white-hot supernova of rage that was almost religious in its intensity. This wasn't just nepotism, the greasing of a wheel for a marginally qualified child. This was active, malicious theft. It was grand larceny of a human being's future, of years of sacrifice and midnight oil, treated with the casual, callous cruelty of a man tossing a gum wrapper out a car window. He hadn't just bought Madison a spot, he'd stolen it from someone else. He reached into the life of a hard-working, brilliant young woman, plucked out her dream, and handed it to his daughter like a canapé. Her gaze, sharp as a scalpel, swept across the ballroom, through the service entrance she'd just used. The doors had swung shut, but in her mind's eye, she could see the corridor. And there, on a discarded, upturned milk crate during a stolen 5-minute break, sat Sophia. The image was seared into her memory. The girl's head was bent not over a phone scrolling through social media, but over a thick, heavy tome. Lydia's judge's eyes, trained over decades to absorb minute, telling details from a witness's demeanor or a document's formatting, re-examined the memory. The book's cover was worn, its spine creased into multiple familiar valleys. The pages were dog-eared, not with casual neglect, but with the frantic, repeated referencing of intense study. The margins were a dense forest of notes in cheap blue ballpoint ink, the handwriting small, disciplined, and urgent. An LSAT prep guide. Not the glossy, latest edition, but a used one, its value measured in absorbed knowledge, not resale price. The pieces of the case, fragments of cruelty, arrogance, and corruption, didn't just connect, they slammed together with the devastating, silent, irrevocable click of a final verdict being rendered. It was the sound of truth locking into place. Sophia Martinez wasn't just a server being bullied by a spoiled bride. She wasn't just a sympathetic figure. She was the nobody. She was the public university grind. She was the girl with the perfect LSAT score. She was the one who studied until her vision blurred in the back of a noisy bus, who worked double shifts in this very club to save for application fees that could have bought her groceries for a month, who dreamed with a fierce, quiet fire that was now being smothered under the weight of Sterling Thorne's philanthropic synergy. This revelation transcended everything. It blew past the social insult, the personal slight against her and Ethan. This was no longer a family drama. It was a profound, systemic crime. It was a violation of the very principle of equal justice under law that was the bedrock of her life's work. Sterling Thorne wasn't just a pompous, social-climbing future in-law. He was a parasite, a socio-economic vampire. He fed on the aspirations, the sweat, the very lifeblood of the Sophias of the world, the strivers, the hungry, the talented poor, to transfuse that stolen vitality into the anemic privilege of his own offspring. He was a man who believed the world's resources, even its dreams, were his to reallocate based on his own warped sense of desert.
Lydia set the champagne bottle down on a nearby side table. She didn't place it, she set it down with a deliberate, heavy thud that was absorbed by the carpet, but resonated in her own soul. The sound was final. It was the gavel strike ending the evidentiary phase of the trial. The discovery phase was conclusively, irrevocably over. She had it all. The motive, unvarnished greed and a pathological need for dominance, both corporate and familial. The method, spoliation of evidence in Box 4000, bribery and fraud in the internship selection. The opportunity, wealth, power, and a network of complicit enablers. And now she had the confession, an uncoerced, boastful, detailed admission to multiple felonies delivered in front of a federal judge. The case was airtight. She reached into the deep pocket of her apron. Her hands, which had trembled with phantom memories of a mop bucket, were now rock steady. The fine muscles were controlled, precise. She pulled out her personal phone, a sleek black device, its case smooth and unadorned. Its silence in this roaring room felt powerful. Her thumb found the power button, and the screen glowed to life, a small rectangle of calm modernity in the Gilded Age spectacle. She navigated without looking, muscle memory guiding her. She opened her contacts and scrolled to a name. William Reynolds. No title, just the name. The keynote speaker for the evening, the senior United States Senator from New York, the man who had been her study partner in torts class, who had drunk cheap beer with her debating the finer points of judicial philosophy, who had stood proudly beside her, his hand on a Bible, when she was sworn into the Second Circuit. Her oldest friend, her most powerful ally, and now her material witness. Her fingers moved over the glass screen. She typed not a paragraph, not an explanation. She typed two precise, unambiguous, pre-agreed sentences, a code they'd established years ago during a hypothetical discussion about corruption and witness protection. Code blue in the kitchen, I need a witness. Code blue, a judicial emergency, an attack on the integrity of the court. The moment hung suspended in the ballroom's gilded air, a bubble of pure, uncut tension. Lydia's Code Blue message was a stone dropped into the pond of the evening, and now the ripples reached the shore. From the direction of the green room, a sanctum even more exclusive than the ballroom itself, came a disruption in the field. The heavy, soundproofed kitchen doors, always swinging with frantic, silent efficiency, did not swing. They were thrust open, not with a gentle push, but with a resonant, authoritative thud that echoed off the marble and the high ceiling, a sound that spoke of interruption, of priority. Conversations within a 20-foot radius stuttered and died, heads turning as if pulled by a single string. Senator William Reynolds stood in the frame, momentarily backlit by the harsh fluorescence of the service corridor. He was a man carved from American political granite, tall, broad-shouldered, with a leonine head of silver hair and the patrician, somewhat weary features of a man who has borne the weight of the Republic. He wore his tuxedo, not as a costume, but as a uniform of state. He was instantly, universally recognizable, a fixture on Sunday talk shows, a name in headlines about bipartisan deals. Flanking him, 2 steps behind and radiating a quiet, lethal competence, were his security detail. Their eyes, hidden behind sunglasses even indoors, swept the room in a practiced, impersonal arc. A wave of excited, hushed murmurs rippled through the crowd, a social seismic tremor. The senator? Here? Now? For many, this was the pinnacle of the evening's validation, proof that the Thorne wedding was an event of national significance. Sterling Thorne's face underwent an instantaneous metamorphosis. The smug post-confessional glow vanished, replaced by a blaze of avaricious, triumphant delight. This was it, the ultimate trophy guest. Power walking directly into his orbit, seeking him out. He could already see the photo in the New York Times society pages. Senator Reynolds shares a laugh with Sterling Thorne at his daughter's engagement gala. He could write the caption in his mind. This was social plutonium, and it was being delivered to his doorstep.
He smoothed the already perfect lapels of his Brioni jacket, his hands moving with a quick, preening flutter. He put on his most statesmanlike, welcoming smile, a careful blend of humility and peerage. He stepped forward, cutting a swift path through the parted crowd, his hand thrust out ahead of him like a spearhead. "Senator Reynolds!" he boomed, his voice a masterpiece of practiced, delighted surprise. "What an unexpected and profound honor! Sterling Thorne, managing partner of Thorne and Partners. We're so thrilled you could join us to celebrate my daughter's—" Reynolds walked right past him. He didn't break stride. He didn't slow. He didn't even glance at the proffered hand, which hung in the air between them, a suddenly ridiculous, grasping thing. The senator's keen blue eyes, sharp as a hawk's, were scanning the room with a focused intensity that had nothing to do with social pleasantries. They swept the glittering throng, the champagne towers, the floral arrangements, and landed with unerring precision on a point by the wall, near a service station cluttered with empty trays and dirty glasses. There, holding a damp, soiled linen cloth, stood a woman in a server's apron. Lydia altered his course and strode directly toward her, his security detail melting into the background but maintaining a watchful perimeter. The crowd, sensing a drama far more compelling than any wedding announcement, parted before him in a hushed, electrified wave. He stopped in front of Lydia. Her brow, usually furrowed with the cares of the nation, was now knitted in genuine, profound, almost comical confusion. He looked from her face, calm and expectant, to the coarse white apron tied around her waist, to the dirty cloth in her hand. "Lydia!" he boomed. His voice, trained for Senate halls and campaign rallies, didn't need a microphone. It cut through the dead silence like a cannon shot. "Judge Vance, for heaven's sake! What in the name of all holy are you doing wearing an apron?" The silence that followed was absolute. It was not the quiet of respect, but the vacuum left in the wake of a detonation, a stillness so profound and pressurized one could hear the faint, almost imaginary drip, drip, drip of a leaky faucet from the distant bar, the rustle of silk as someone shifted their weight, the frantic, muffled beat of 100 hearts. Sterling Thorne's arm lowered slowly, as if the muscles had forgotten their purpose. His hand fell to his side, limp. He turned his head slowly, mechanically, like a man in a dream, from the retreating back of the senator to the woman in the apron, then back to the senator, then back to the woman. His brain, a finely tuned instrument for social calculation and legal leverage, was experiencing a catastrophic systems failure. The data points, server, apron, damp cloth, senator, Judge Vance, refused to coalesce into any logical shape. His face underwent a horrifying transformation. The flush of triumph and alcohol drained away in a visible wave, receding from his forehead, his cheeks, his neck, leaving behind a sickly, corpse-like gray. The blood seemed to have fled his body entirely, pooling somewhere in the pit of his stomach, leaving his skin taut and waxy. He looked, in his perfect tuxedo, like a man who had just been informed of his own death. "Judge?" The word escaped Madison Thorne's lips as a tiny, airless squeak, the sound a mouse might make under a descending boot. Her hand, holding her champagne flute, went slack. The glass tilted, golden liquid sloshing over the rim to splash, unheeded, onto the priceless ivory silk of her skirt, leaving a dark, spreading stain. She didn't notice. Her eyes were wide, frozen saucers of dawning, unimaginable horror. Every eye in the ballroom, every partner, every socialite, every server who had dared to pause was locked on the trio, the powerful senator, the ashen patriarch, and the woman in the apron. Lydia Vance did not rush. She did not smile in vindication. She moved with the slow, deliberate, ceremonial grace of a priest preparing for a sacrament. She reached behind her, her fingers finding the knot of the apron strings. She untied it. Not with a yank, but with a careful, deliberate pull. She looped the long strings free, then she grasped the sides of the stiff white fabric, pulled it up and over her head and off her body. She held the apron for a moment, looking at it.
the symbol of invisibility, the tool of her investigation. Then, with a quiet finality, she folded it, not haphazardly, but neatly, precisely, into a perfect, crisp square. She turned and placed it on a nearby tray of empty, discarded champagne glasses. The white cotton against the silver was a stark still life of concluded business. Finally, she smoothed the lapels of her navy suit jacket, a simple, powerful gesture of reclamation. She straightened her spine, and the transformation was complete. The slight, servile slump was gone. The averted gaze vanished. She stood at her full, commanding height, and the air around her seemed to solidify with authority. The gray rock was gone. In its place stood a mountain. When she looked up, her gaze sweeping the stunned faces before settling on Madison, she was no longer invisible. She was the focal point, the gravitational center of the entire universe contained within those four walls. She was the Honorable Lydia Vance. "Actually, Miss Thorne," she said. Her voice was not raised. It didn't need to be. It projected with an effortless, room-filling clarity of a judge delivering a landmark opinion from the bench, a tone honed to be heard by the back row without ever becoming a shout. It was calm, precise, and carried the weight of inscribed law. She let that title, that reality, hang in the silence for a beat, allowing its significance to sink in, to rewrite the narrative of the entire evening. "The same court, as it happens," she continued, her eyes shifting to Sterling, who looked as if he might vomit, "is currently reviewing the briefs for your father's firm's proposed $40 billion Meridian merger." Sterling made a sound, a wet, choking gasp, like a drain trying to swallow something too large. "Judge Vance, we had no idea." The words were glue in his mouth. He forced a laugh, a horrible, strangled sound that died in his throat. "This is clearly a hilarious misunderstanding, a comedy of errors. We were just, earlier, locker room talk, boasting, you know how that is." Lydia took 3 slow, deliberate steps forward. Each click of her low heel on the marble was a nail in a coffin. She closed the distance between them, invading his personal space, the space he had always used to dominate. He didn't just step back, he shrank, his shoulders hunching, his head pulling into his neck like a turtle, as if her mere presence now emitted a corrosive radiation. "Was it a joke, Mr. Thorne?" she asked, her voice dropping to a register colder than the ice in the shattered champagne flute, "when you admitted to a conspiracy to violate the Clean Water Act? Was it boasting when you detailed your plan to bury the critical toxicity reports in box 4000 of the discovery files with the explicit intent to defraud my court and the Department of Justice?" His lips were completely bloodless, 2 thin gray lines. "That is a privileged attorney-client conversation," he blurted.
The fallout wasn't a scandal. It was a structural implosion. A scandal is a crack in the facade, a repairable breach of decorum. What followed the Harvard Club was the catastrophic failure of a load-bearing wall, the violent collapse of an entire ecosystem built on whispered deals, blind deference, and the absolute certainty of impunity. It wasn't a story, it was a geological event. 3 months later, the headlines were still running, not as breaking news, but as a grim, satisfying serialization of ruin. Each byline was another brick mortared into the imposing, lonely mausoleum of Sterling Thorne's career. The Wall Street Journal, front page, above the fold. Meridian megamerger blocked. Judge Vance cites egregious bad faith and a deliberate fraud upon this court, cites uncovered toxicity reports willfully concealed by Thorne and Partners. The New York Times, business section. Thorne and Partners under federal grand jury investigation for obstruction of justice, conspiracy. DOJ subpoenas partner communications, Senate Judiciary Committee opens inquiry. The American Lawyer. State Bar Association moves to revoke Sterling Thorne's license. Ethics panel calls ballroom transcript a stunning, unprecedented confession. New York Post. Screaming headline: Society wedding bells turn to jail cells. Cleaning lady judge sinks billionaire lawyer. Bloomberg: Meridian deal collapse sends shockwaves. Thorne firm faces billions in liability. Shareholder lawsuits. A firm built on sand, analysts say. Washington Post: Senator Reynolds submits transcript as official evidence, urges swift, severe accountability to preserve judicial integrity. The transcript, meticulously reconstructed from Lydia's eidetic memory and corroborated word for word by Senator Reynolds' sworn affidavit, was more than evidence. It was a legal neutron bomb. It annihilated the target with surgical, radioactive precision while leaving the surrounding landscape of legal precedent eerily intact, a pristine, terrifying monument to self-destruction. Phrases like Box 4000, cafeteria receipts, and she doesn't have the brain power entered the legal lexicon as shorthand for professional suicide. The firm's reputation, a gilded edifice polished over 3 generations, didn't just tarnish, it vaporized, leaving behind a social and financial vacuum. The partners who had formed that congratulatory phalanx around Sterling Thorne became a stampede. Senior names, etched on mahogany doors for decades, vanished overnight. They issued sterile, cowardly statements, pursuing new challenges, a mutual decision to part ways, returning to a focus on independent practice. Their faces, captured by photographers as they scurried from the firm's iconic tower with boxes in their arms, were studies of pale, desperate anonymity. The rats, as the saying went, were not just leaving the sinking ship, they were denying they ever knew it was a ship. Clients, global banks, tech titans, old money trusts, terminated their relationships with a cold, bureaucratic finality that was more brutal than any shouting match. The elegant, cream-colored engagement letters were replaced with terse, formal notices of termination, citing irreconcilable conflicts and loss of confidence. The $40 billion dream didn't just die, it putrefied, spawning a hydra of litigation, shareholder class actions alleging fiduciary negligence, DOJ suits for fraud, environmental group actions for the concealed contamination. The dream was now a multi-billion-dollar nightmare of liability. Sterling Thorne didn't just lose the case. He lost the firm that bore his name. He lost his corner office with the panoramic view, now occupied by a receiver. He lost his memberships at the Harvard Club, the Knickerbocker, the Lynx. He lost the deferential nods on the street, replaced by averted eyes and the occasional muffled snicker. He was sued for divorce by Celeste, who cited irreconcilable differences and secured a settlement that left her comfortably in Palm Beach, alone. The foundations of his life, constructed not on bedrock but on the shifting, treacherous sands of wealth, fear, and transactional loyalty, had liquefied utterly. He became a ghost in the canyons of Manhattan, a walking cautionary tale whispered about at law school orientation lectures on ethics. But for Lydia, observing the implosion from the serene height of her chambers with the detached interest of a seismologist, this was merely the necessary, punitive demolition. It was the satisfying, clean snap of a bone being reset. Yet the real justice, the nourishing, systemic kind that fed the soul and corrected the universe's tilted axis, was quieter, more profound. It was in the reallocation of assets, the restoration of balance, the return of stolen property. Scene: 3 months later, the chambers of Judge Lydia Vance. Morning light, potent and clarifying, streamed through the tall, arched windows of her chambers in the Thurgood Marshall United States Courthouse. It fell in wide, generous planes across the muted tones of the Persian rug, set the dust motes dancing in sacred silence, and finally pooled on the rich, burnished expanse of her mahogany desk. The room was a cathedral of reasoned order. Leather-bound federal reporters and U.S. codes stood sentinel on floor-to-ceiling shelves. A sitting area with deep burgundy leather chairs awaited counsel.
In the corner, the American flag hung still and solemn. On the desk, next to a slender crystal vase holding a single perfect white orchid, lay her gavel, an unadorned, dense cylinder of ebony, its weight speaking of consequence. Lydia sat in her high-backed judicial chair, the black robe hanging on a polished stand behind her like a dormant avatar of power. She wore a simple, impeccably tailored cream silk blouse. Before her lay a stack of orders and opinions. Her pen, a classic fountain pen, moved across the pages with swift, decisive strokes. Swish, scratch, sign. A soft, familiar knock preceded the door opening. Ethan peered in. The change in him was not just emotional, it was physical. The chronic tension that had lived in the set of his shoulders, the tightness around his mouth and eyes for the better part of a year, had dissolved. He stood with an easy, natural posture. He wore a well-cut but unpretentious navy suit, a world away from the stiff, rented tuxedo of that night. In his hands were 2 paper cups of coffee from the cart on Pearl Street, a small plume of steam rising from the sip-hole of each lid. "Brought a judicial bribe," he said, a genuine, relaxed smile spreading across his face as he entered. "Black, no sugar, as bitter as your average appellant's chances." She looked up, and the stern, analytical mask of the judge melted into the deep, warm creases of a mother's love. "The only thing I find bitter is the continued existence of the procedural loophole they're arguing in Jenkins versus State. But I'll take the coffee. Thank you." He handed it to her, took the familiar seat across the vast desk from her, and stretched his legs out with a long, cathartic sigh that seemed to expel the last vestiges of a trapped, toxic atmosphere. He took a sip, gazing out the window at the forest of steel and glass that was the financial district. "It's quieter," he said, after a comfortable silence. "The city or your conscience?" she asked, setting her pen down precisely parallel to the document she was signing. "Both. Remarkably so." He turned back to her, his eyes clear. "I met with the head of the criminal defense practice at the Legal Aid Society yesterday. They're not just taking me back, they're creating a new focus group on white-collar recidivism and the impact on low-income communities. They said my recent immersive experience with the pathology of entitlement could be invaluable." He gave a wry, self-deprecating shrug. "Turns out getting entangled with a corrupt dynasty looks good on a public defender's resume." A fierce, proud warmth bloomed in Lydia's chest. "I have no doubt you will represent the underserved with even greater insight now. You've seen the beast in its lair." He nodded, swirling the coffee in his cup, his expression turning thoughtful. "She called me yesterday. Madison." Lydia didn't react, didn't stiffen. She merely took a slow sip of her own coffee, her eyebrow lifting a millimeter, a silent invitation to proceed. "She's working at a boutique in Soho, Maison de something, sells cashmere throws that cost more than my monthly student loan payment. It's part of that voluntary community service and restitution agreement she signed with the Oversight Committee to avoid a formal fraud prosecution." He offered a faint, complicated smile that held more pity than bitterness. "She said her feet hurt. She said she had no idea the internship was stolen, that her father handled those things. She said a lot of things that sounded like lines from a very bad, very expensive lawyer." Lydia picked up her pen again, signing another order with a firm, fluid signature. "Good. Physical discomfort is a primal and excellent pedagogue. It roots you in the corporeal reality that excessive privilege works very hard to anesthetize. Standing for 8 hours on a hard floor, managing the caprices of wealthy customers, worrying about inventory shrinkage and the cost of a broken vase, it's a foundational curriculum in consequence. Perhaps she'll learn that respect isn't an inheritance."
The scene, etched in the deep relief of Lydia's memory, shifted to a gray Tuesday afternoon a week prior. The Thurgood Marshall Courthouse was a hive of solemn activity, but Lydia had carved out 2 hours in her docket. She wasn't using her resources for vengeance. That was a small, bitter flame, and the conflagration consuming Sterling Thorne was already well fueled by his own actions. No, she was engaged in a more delicate, more sacred operation, restoration, the meticulous relaying of the stolen cornerstone. She had tasked Anya, her most discreet and resourceful clerk, with the investigation. Find her. Quietly. I don't want a file, I want a location, a place she goes to be herself, not to serve. Anya, who had grown up in Queens and understood the geography of aspiration, had needed less than a day. The main branch, the Rose Reading Room. She's there every day she's not working, from 2 p.m. until closing. She sits at the same table under the third chandelier from the north wall. Lydia did not go in her robes. The black cloth was a symbol of immense power, and this meeting was not about power exerted, but power returned. She wore a simple, elegant pantsuit of charcoal gray wool, a single strand of pearls, low-heeled pumps. She looked like a serious academic, a foundation director, anything but a federal judge. She carried a slim, calfskin briefcase. The New York Public Library was a palace for the people. Its steps were worn smooth by millions of seeking feet. The smell inside was the same as it had been for a century. Old paper, lemon oil, stone dust, and the quiet electric hum of concentrated thought. Lydia moved through the grand lobby, past the whispering marble lions, and into the cathedral vastness of the Rose Main Reading Room. Her breath caught, as it always did here. The celestial ceiling, the endless oak tables radiating under soft lampshade, the silent, diverse army of readers. A teenager with headphones studying for the SAT, an elderly man peering at a genealogy text, a fashion student sketching frantically, a homeless woman meticulously organizing her belongings beside a stack of philosophy books. Here, in this temple, everyone was equal before the altar of knowledge. Pedigree was irrelevant. The only currency was curiosity. The only credential, a library card. Her eyes found Sophia immediately. Anya's description was poetically precise. There, under the soft glow of the third majestic chandelier, she was a small island of fierce focus in the quiet sea. The fortress of books had grown. The dog-eared ULSAT guide was now flanked by Chemerinsky's Constitutional Law, the Federalist Papers, a heavily tabbed copy of the U.S. Code, and a battered paperback of The Concept of Law by H.L. Hart. She was scribbling in a notebook, her brow furrowed, chewing on the end of her pen. She wore a faded Barnard College sweatshirt, the letters peeling. Her hair was pulled into a messy but practical bun. She was, in this light, stripped of the uniform of servitude, purely and powerfully a scholar, a seeker. Lydia's heart contracted with a sharp, proud ache. This was the nobody. This was the public university grind Sterling had dismissed. This was the raw, magnificent talent he had tried to bury. She approached slowly, not wanting to startle. She pulled out the heavy wooden chair opposite Sophia. The girl didn't look up, lost in a labyrinth of legal reasoning. Lydia sat. She waited a full minute, simply observing the beautiful intensity of Sophia's work. Finally, she cleared her throat softly. Sophia glanced up, irritation flashing in her deep brown eyes, the universal look of the interrupted thinker. Then recognition dawned. It was a slow, painful sunrise. First confusion, the familiar yet unplaceable face from a traumatic night. Then the memory clicked. The apron, the kindness, the calm voice in the storm. Fear followed, quick, instinctive. Was she in trouble? Had there been a complaint? Then bewilderment. Why was this woman here? Can I help you? Sophia whispered, her voice guarded, her body tensing to flee. I hope so, Lydia said, her own voice a low, reassuring murmur. My name is Lydia. I was at the Harvard Club that night. I was the other server, the one who helped you clean up the glass. Sophia's posture softened a fraction, but the wariness remained. She gave a small, tight nod. I remember. Thank you for that. Again, I'm not here about the glass, Lydia said. She leaned forward slightly, her hands folded on the table. I'm here because I heard something else that night, after you left. I heard a conversation about an internship. A stolen one. All the color drained from Sophia's face. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. The guardedness was replaced with a raw, vulnerable horror. It was the look of someone whose deepest, most private wound had just been exposed to a stranger. How could you? She stammered. Lydia continued, her voice gentle but inexorable.
The men who were laughing at you were celebrating. The father was boasting that his daughter had gotten a prestigious position. He mentioned that another applicant, a girl from a state school with a perfect LSAT, had been removed from consideration, her application misplaced. He said it was a shame, but she didn't have the pedigree. He said they couldn't let the spot go to waste on someone who'd end up in legal aid. Each word was a scalpel, laying bare the grotesque crime. Sophia listened, her eyes growing wider, filling with a storm of emotions. Shame, rage, a grief so profound it was metaphysical. She looked down at her books, at her notes, at the evidence of her years of labor. It all seemed suddenly cheap, pathetic, worthless. "I knew," she whispered, the sound torn from her throat. "My score, my references. I called, I emailed. They said there was no record, a system error. They were so polite, so final." A single tear escaped, tracing a path through the faint dust on her cheek. "So you heard him say it? Out loud?" "I heard him confess to it," Lydia said, her tone leaving no room for doubt. "In detail, to a room full of his friends." She paused, letting the gravity of that confession settle. "I also heard him confess to other things, illegal things that are now being investigated by the Justice Department." Sophia looked up, a flicker of something harder in her eyes. Will he be punished? That process is underway, but punishment for him isn't why I'm here." Lydia unclasped her briefcase. The sound was loud in the hushed room. She withdrew a single, heavy, cream-colored envelope sealed with an embossed sticker. She placed it on the oak table between them, directly atop a diagram of the 3 branches of government Sophia had been sketching. "Restoration is." Sophia stared at the envelope as if it were a live artifact from a tomb. She made no move to touch it. "What is that?" "Open it." Hesitantly, as if it might burn her, Sophia picked up the envelope. Her fingers, ink-stained and bitten at the nails, trembled violently. She peeled back the seal, the paper tearing with a crisp sound. She pulled out the letter. It was on official Department of Justice letterhead. The embossing was deep, tangible under her thumb. The language was formal, precise. "To Ms. Sophia Isabel Martinez, from the Director Summer Associate Program of the Office of the Solicitor General. Subject, offer of appointment and formal apology. Dear Ms. Martinez, this letter constitutes a formal offer of appointment to the Summer Associate Program of the Office of the Solicitor General, commencing date 2024. Following an exhaustive internal audit and review of the selection process for the aforementioned cycle, the Oversight Committee has identified a grave administrative and ethical breach that resulted in the improper exclusion of your application from final consideration. This was a profound failure of our protocols, for which we offer our deepest and most sincere apologies. Your application materials have been retrieved and re-entered into the blind review process. We are pleased to inform you that upon this review, conducted by a newly constituted and fully vetted independent panel, your application was ranked unequivocally first among all candidates nationwide. The notes from the panel, which we are permitted to share anonymously, cite a staggering analytical clarity, a profound moral and constitutional compass evident in the writing sample, and an intellectual rigor that is, in one word, exceptional. Accordingly, we extend this offer, which includes a full stipend, a full housing allowance for Washington, D.C., and mentorship under Deputy Solicitor General, name. We also extend an invitation to meet with members of the Oversight Committee to discuss reforms to prevent such a failure from ever occurring again. Your talent belongs here. We hope you will join us. Sincerely, signature. Director. Attached was a separate, simpler note on plain paper in a different, elegant hand. It read, Ms. Martinez, the apology in the official letter is from the institution. This one is from me. I am sorry for what was taken from you. I'm sorry for the arrogance that assumed your dream was negotiable. The law you wish to practice is better for having you in its ranks. Do not let this experience harden you. Let it fortify your resolve to ensure others do not face the same locked door. The door is open. Walk through it. A friend of the court. Sophia read the official letter, then she read it again, then she read the handwritten note. Her breath hitched. She brought a hand to her mouth, stifling a sound.
She looked from the papers to Lydia, her eyes wide, swimming in tears of sheer disbelieving shock. This is real? The question was a child's whisper, hoping for magic but braced for cruelty. It is the single most real document to come out of that entire night. The audit was real, the new panel was real, their evaluation was real, the ranking was real, the offer is real, the stipend is deposited, the apartment in Georgetown is being held. It is yours. Not because of pity, not because of what happened, but because you earned it. Long before Sterling Thorne ever decided to play God with other people's lives, you had already earned this.